So welcome everyone to April's Campfire chat. I'm Charlotte Paul, the Planned Giving Consultant for the Donor Motivation Program representing Vancouver Island. And I am thrilled to be here today with my very special guest and friend, Brad Offman, to discuss something we're both pretty passionate about, which is donor advised funds. So Brad, do you want to take a moment to just introduce yourself to the folks on the line?
Sure. Thanks, Char. I'm waiting for the campfire.
S'mores. S'mores too.
Delicious. My name is Brad Offman. Thrilled to be here today. I am the CEO of a firm called Spire Philanthropy. We provide philanthropic advisory support to both charities and corporations. Charlotte and I worked together for almost 10 years at McKenzie Investments, where I was the Senior VP of Strategic Philanthropy and spent my time at McKenzie starting up a donor advised fund for the Power Financial group of companies, which include McKenzie Investors Group and Canada Life.
Great. So let's start off with the very basics, because you and I discussed this when we were chatting and preparing for this call. What exactly is a donor advised fund? Because I think we may have done a good job of overcomplicating things when they first launched. So at its very core, what would you say a donor advised fund is?
Yeah, I agree. I think we've definitely overcomplicated things. And now that donor advised funds have been around for so long, people really assume that they should probably know what they are. And you can get deep in the weeds and you can really overcomplicate them. But at the end of the day, what a donor advised fund is a charitable savings account. That's probably the easiest way to think about it. Your donations to the fund, your irrevocable donations into the donor advised fund are your deposits, and your withdrawals come in the form of grants to the charities that you want to support for your fund, from your fund. So at the end of the day, it's really just an account. It's a little different in that, of course, the funds that you transfer into the account are no longer yours. You can't get them back. But other than that, it operates very much like a traditional account with deposits and withdrawals.
I think that's a great way of thinking of it, and a very simple way of putting it into context for people. And these things have been around. You mentioned, I think 2005, 2006, they were brought to Canadian market through community foundations, and then through retail channels like McKenzie that we discussed. So how have you really seen the product evolve over time?
Well, I think one of the biggest ways that the product has evolved is, you're right, donor advised funds came to Canada. They were brought to Canada through the community foundation movement, and there are about 200 community foundations. And probably the biggest change in the donor advised fund space happened in 2004 when TD was the first, I'll say, commercial financial institution to launch a donor advised fund. And what we've seen in the past, 15 to 20 years is really the proliferation of donor advised funds within the financial services sector in Canada. So all the banks have them. Most major financial institutions now will have a proprietary donor advised fund program.
And how do you think that's impacted giving and the philanthropic conversation on a whole?
It's a really good question. I think it's had a really fundamental impact on the donor conversation, because when you think about charitable giving in Canada, the way I like to think about it, and sometimes, I have a tendency to get deep in the weeds, as do many when we're talking about strategic giving, is that there are really two fundamentally different ways to give to charity. Let's say you have $1 million or $100,000 and you want to give it away to charity. You can give it directly, or you can give it indirectly. So you can give it directly to the charities that you know and love and want to support, or you can give it indirectly by putting the money in a donor advised fund or a private foundation, and then supporting your favorite charities with grants over time. So what donor advised funds have really done, because they have made indirect giving so accessible, right? When we think about private foundations, we think in terms of millions of dollars, but donor advised funds have made in the form of indirect giving accessible for a huge swath of Canadian donors who might not have had the ability to set up a private foundation. And I think that has fundamentally changed the giving landscape. Neither indirect nor direct giving is better. There's no better way of giving, but donors have different preferences, and what a donor advised fund does is allow a donor to really tap into their preference, whether they prefer the indirect method of giving or the direct method of giving.
Yeah, and I think it also, from the advisor standpoint, it just enriches the conversations you can have with a client about philanthropic mindset, instead of saying, how are we going to directly give to charity XYZ or donate to capital gains from this stock. It becomes a much richer conversation when you bring in donor advised funds. It becomes estate planning and legacy planning, and even generational philanthropic conversations. So I think from both sides, it's really enriched that conversation that we're having with donors. So on the charity side, how have you seen charities adopting to donor advised funds?
Well, I think one question that comes up a lot when I speak to charities is, you have hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, that have been directed into donor advised funds, both at community foundations and through commercial programs. And I thought, actually, I wasn't planning to do this, but I got this email yesterday from a friend of mine, a very senior fundraiser, asking about donor advised funds. I'm going to read it. Can I read it?
Perfect.
I get this kind of email all the time.
Maybe don't say the name, right?
I'm not going to say the name. No, I'm not going to say the name, but it's somebody, it wouldn't be disparaging at all if I said the name, but I'm not going to mention the person's name.
Okay.
So the person said, I was wondering if you would be able to provide me with some direction with respect to this donor advised fund. Do they have a list of charities that they consult, or are they open to receiving information to potentially pass along to DAF holders? I realize DAFs don't necessarily choose the charities they wish to support, but wasn't sure if they look to charities for guidance on various sector needs. Do you know if they would be open to receiving some information about our programs and who we are helping? So
yeah.
So the fundamental question there is, how do we raise money from donor advised funds? How do we fundraise from donor advised funds, knowing that it's a very large and increasingly large swath of money that is being directed to donor advised funds? The short answer when it comes to fundraising is you don't. It's very difficult to fundraise from donor advised funds. Most of the funds are donor directed. The donors know the organizations they want to support. They might turn to some donor advised funds will provide some direction to their donors around the organizations that they wish to support. But for charities, and of the 85,000 charities that exist in Canada, it's very difficult for them to get in front of a donor advised fund or the donor advised fund donors. So that raises the question, well, what do charities do? Knowing that we probably can't fundraise because the donor advised funds are not going to put my organization in front of the donor, what do we do? And the short answer is, start with great stewardship. A lot of charities say, well, we're really good at stewarding our donors. Well, does that include your donor advised fund donors? So if you as an organization are receiving an existing grant from a donor advised fund, what are you doing to steward that donor? Are you providing that thank you information directly to the donor advised fund? Are you providing information that they could potentially pass on to the donors? Now, not all donor advised funds will do that, just so you know. Some will and some won't. There are many different donor advised funds. Some do a better job of passing on information to donors than others. But I think there's a real opportunity here. There's probably a real opportunity to create better relationships between the donor advised funds and operating charities. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but for starters, I think that charities need to do a better job of stewarding the donor advised fund grants that come in. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone and call the donor advised fund provider. Is there anything that you can do? Is there that the donor might need? Is there any information that I can provide? Do you pass on information to donors? And if there's anything that they can give you that might provide a conduit into that donor, take advantage of that so that you can steward the donor and then likely have a much greater chance of receiving a grant from that donor advised fund in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking as somebody who, as you know, our family has a donor advised fund as a legacy product for someone who passed away. And when we set that up, it wasn't like, oh, let's set up a donor advised fund and give money to charity. We had a very specific purpose for setting that up because we had a charity that we were giving to, and we needed the structure. We wanted to have that structure in place where we could do perpetual giving. So I think the idea that, you know, from a charity perspective of getting in front of the donor advised funds and then expecting the grants to come is sort of backwards, right? They're usually set up with a purpose in mind, and usually quite a specific purpose. So I think you're right that it is very difficult for charities to fundraise from donor advised funds, which I'm sure is frustrating because, as we all know, donor advised funds are the biggest. Are they the biggest, fastest growing?
Yeah, they're the fastest growing philanthropic vehicle in Canada, no question about it.
Right. So it's like
Getting
you
grants,
kind of, yeah. So it's like you have to sort of be a part of it, but how to be a part of it is that $1 million question, right? So the stewardship piece that you have talked about, I think, is key to that.
I think the fundamental question, Char, is you know, if you're a charity that's receiving a grant from a donor advised fund, and I think most charities do receive grants, or at least most mid to large size charities would be receiving grants from one or more donor advised funds, many, in some cases, probably multiple grants. The question should not necessarily be, how do we get more of these? The question should be, how do we maintain the grants that we're getting? How do we steward these donors in a meaningful way to get them to continue with their grants and maybe even increase their grants if they feel like we're doing a good job?
And what about on the other side of that? What about the advisors who are facilitating the funding of these donor advised funds? Do you see a lot of advisors incorporating it into their practice? I know you and I did a lot of roadshows and advisor presentations about donor advised funds when they were first sort of brought to market. How have you seen that evolved?
Well, I think just the sheer proliferation of donor advised funds and their growth, and you know, the fact that so many financial institutions are offering them means that many, if not most, financial advisors are aware of donor advised funds. And you know, back when 15 years ago, there were very, very few financial advisors, I would think, were meaningfully incorporating philanthropy and charitable giving into their practice. And that number is growing every year. I think advisors are recognizing that strategic charitable giving is really an important and integral part of holistic wealth planning. I mean, we all know, or many of us know the incredible tax implications of charitable giving, and there's great planning opportunities around that. But just from a values-based perspective, advisors are recognizing that philanthropy can truly, a conversation around philanthropy can truly change and improve the relationship that they have, excuse me, with their clients. But you know, I would turn it back to you, Charlotte, as an advisor who I know is incorporating charitable giving into your client conversations. Like, how has it changed your practice? I mean, you're the practitioner, not me. What are you seeing out there, and maybe how has it changed your relationship with your clients?
I don't think it's changed it because I've always sort of drank the Kool-Aid, if you will. So it's always been a part of the conversation, and not only a part of the conversation for those who can give today, but for those who maybe can't give today, but planting the seed for tomorrow. So it's always on the list of, you know, review. Have you made any donations this year? What would you like for that to look like in the future. Because not everybody can give today, but there are, strategic ways we can plan for gifts in the future. Um, so, but I think just going back to advisors adopting DAFs into their practice, I think you're right. I think that there's a lot more resources and tools available for advisors to understand why it's important to be having these conversations with their clients. And if I get a call from a charity partner that we have asking me about donation of shares or other things that a donor has come to ask the charity, my first question is, why haven't they had this conversation with their advisor? Because those conversations should really be starting with the advisor. So, in my mind, that's, a huge red flag that if somebody has these philanthropic wishes and their advisor isn't bringing it up with them in the first place, they might be looking for a new advisor. So I think you have to be very conscious of that today as an advisor. There's no downside to it as far as I see it, is having those conversations.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think what charities need to understand is that these conversations are really happening at the advisor level, and not just with the financial advisor, but with accountants and lawyers. So the growth of advisors talking to their clients about charitable giving has really, probably more than anything else, changed the landscape of the ecosystem of giving, right? The relationship in the past, 25 years ago, the relationship was always directly between the charity and the donor. And what donor advised funds have done, in part, have really introduced the advisor as part of that equation. Like no major charitable gift in Canada happens today without advisors on board. It just doesn't happen. Sometimes those gifts, if they're involving more complex assets, can certainly need advisors at the table. But even if they don't need an advisor, the advisor will be at the table. So charities need to recognize that. They need to recognize that advisors are an important part of the philanthropic ecosystem now in Canada. And I think there's no getting around that. And I think that's a good thing, because advisors are the ones who have the financial relationship, so they can help push the clients to maybe do more. They can help them understand that maybe they have more assets than they'll ever need, and that can perpetuate a conversation about giving.
Or even I think it's the flip side too, for the clients who think they don't have enough assets, educating them about, donation through shares and things like that. It's quite incredible how many people think they don't have enough to give away, who, when you do some education around it, are like, wow, I actually can make a meaningful gift to a charity. So it's quite powerful, those discussions. But I think the other side of it too is advisors and charities realizing that having a relationship is not going to introduce the charity to the advisors, high net worth clients, and having a relationship with charity is not going to introduce the advisor to the high net worth donors, right? So how do you see that relationship best working between the advisor and the charity?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's a fair statement. I remember when I was working in for a charity, and I remember thinking that, oh, well, I should be going to talk to advisors because they're going to want to put my charity in front of their clients. And typically advisors won't do that. They're just not willing to do that. While they're willing to raise the subject of giving and philanthropy, I think it's fair to say, and you can confirm this, of course, that advisors, lawyers, accountants, financial advisors aren't always willing to put a specific charity in front of their client unless a client really starts kind of leading them in that direction. I think what charities need to be able to do is provide advisors with the tools and the resources that they need to incorporate giving into their practice. So, they can become great resources for advisors, like if they have materials on planned giving and the benefits of incorporating a charity into their will. Charities can really provide that information to advisors. Don't assume that advisors are getting that information from other sources. Most advisors are not members of CAGP. Most advisors are not getting that information readily from the financial institutions for which they work. They might have to dig for it a little bit. So charities can become a great resource. And if you can be that resource for a professional advisor or a group of professional advisors, it can be incredibly valuable. Will that lead to more funding for your organization? But I don't know, but it certainly won't hurt. And it will position you and your organization, as a credible outlet for their clients' philanthropy.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I recall when we first started talking about these, I think it was 2007, you and I, some pushback from charities like that a donor advised fund is a competitive product.
Yeah.
Do you still hear that or see that?
Well, we need a lot of evidence to really figure it out. But there's this notion, and I've heard it, and and even when I was working, in the community foundation movement, this notion that these commercial donor advised funds would take away from community foundations. My feeling on that has always been that donor advised funds are growing the pie. They're not taking any money away from charities. They're actually contributing more. And don't forget, every dollar that finds its way into a donor advised fund will eventually find its way into the hands of an operating charity. It might take a while, but it will make its way there. I think donors who gravitate towards indirect giving wouldn't necessarily, for example, I'll be even more specific. If I have $1 million and I'm inclined to set up a donor advised fund, that doesn't mean if I didn't set up a donor advised fund that I would direct that money directly to charities. I just might do nothing at all. I just really like the structure that a donor advised fund provides. And as a result, I'm going to use that to facilitate my giving. I think that's the majority of donor advised fund donors. And again, because it's growing the size of the pie, I think everybody who's working in and around donor advised funds feels the same way, that we're driving more money into the charitable sector. Again, remember, every dollar that finds its way into the hands of a donor advised fund will eventually find its way into the hands of an operating charity. And that's a good thing, for sure. That's a good thing. And I think donor advised funds provide people with an opportunity to donate significant sums of money without having, while at the same time, having the flexibility to decide when that money finds its way into the hands of the charities that they want to support. And people really like that. Clearly, the growth of donor advised funds is reflective of the fact that people really like the structures that they afford.
Yeah, and I think also the flexibility as well that they offer is just quite different perhaps than what people have been used to when they're making planned gifts, is having multiple charities as recipients of your planned giving and being able to name successors of your donor advised fund. So incorporating those conversations perhaps with the next generation in your family. I think all of those things have made the product very appealing to
Right.
people, and also more accessible. Like, you don't have to have $1 million in a DAF to give to charity and to have a foundation in your name, right? So all of those things I think have just helped grow the appeal of them.
No question about it. I mean, the fact that they are, one of the things that we've seen over the especially since the major changes to the first round of major changes to the disbursement quota rules in 2010, is donor advised funds are inherently flexible vehicles. I mean, most donor advised fund providers allow for full flexibility in terms of how the funds are withdrawn or granted out to the charities that they want to support. And that's a good thing, right? So that flexibility, that accessibility makes them incredibly appealing for donors. They're not going away. As a sector, we need to understand that donor advised funds are here to stay. I think donor advised fund providers, and we work with a lot of them on the commercial side, and I come from the community foundation movement. But especially the commercial donor advised fund providers need to understand that they are also, by virtue of creating a donor advised fund, part of our sector, part of the charitable sector. Can't get away from it. You need to understand how to build relationships with charities. You need to provide models that allow for the stewardship of the grants that you're sending out. So I think it's really important that the commercial providers all recognize that as well. Definitely better than we were 10 or 15 years ago, but I think we still have work to do in that area.
So on that note, do you want to give a quick update on the MFAP, just where we're at with that and how that's sort of facilitating some of those conversations?
Sure. Yeah, the MFAP is interesting. You know, if we were having this conversation in 2005 or 2010, this idea that there would be a professional designation for advisors in charitable giving was completely foreign. Like there just wasn't a demand for it. Nobody thought that there would, anybody would want something like that. And, 10, 15 years later, we have, hundreds of advisors across Canada who have achieved the designation. It's a growing designation. It's called MFAP, which stands for Master Financial Advisor in Philanthropy. It's offered through the Knowledge Bureau. If you want more information, go to the Knowledge Bureau website. But it's a recognition that advisors are really interested in incorporating charitable giving into their practice, and that they need a formal setting where they can learn more. That, and of course, we're always encouraging people to get involved with the Canadian Association of Gift Planners as members, whether they're advisors or whether they work in the charitable sector, because CAGP always has been and always will be the best repository for information on strategic philanthropy in Canada.
Yes, and on that note, I know we don't have time for Q&A today, but you and I will both be there next week in Vancouver for the national conference. So if anybody has any follow-up questions, come find us, and we're happy to have a chat. We're just sort of about to close it off. Brad, any final thoughts that you want to share before we end?
Well, I see that there have been some great questions posed in the chat, and I know we don't have time for them. And you're right. If you're going to be at CAGP next week, we should chat more about it. But I really do love the idea of figuring out a better model that would exist between donor advised funds and operating charities. And I see that people are really actively trying to steward their donor advised funds grants that come in, and that's great. I'm happy that you're doing that, and I'm happy that some donor advised fund providers are providing a model that allows for stewardship. But I still think, I don't know what the model is, but I'd love to figure out a way to create something where GAFs and charities work together, and so that we can, for one, end any misconceptions and recognize that donor advised funds are, in my strong and humble opinion, good for philanthropy in Canada.
Agreed on all of that. So I just want to thank you very much for joining us today and having this conversation. I think we covered a lot of really good points and lots of good things to take away and think about. Just as a reminder, next month, our Campfire chat will take place on Thursday, May 11th. Same time, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's going to be hosted by our Vancouver DMP consultant, Rich Whitfield, and his very special guest, Shelby Wilson, who is the Director of Philanthropy of the Terry Fox Foundation. So we will look forward to seeing you all on that call, if not before in Vancouver. Thanks, everyone.